here we go with Game 11 that you just saw come to a close, officially crowning Magnus Carlsen yet again as our World Chess Champion. We had an Italian on the board, and now that the match is behind us, what was the final evaluation then here? I guess you really just give the nod to Magnus Carlsen's team for showing up prepared to play the Lopez and say, come beat my Marshall. I don't think you can do it. Ultimately, Jan was forced to go probing elsewhere. He tried in English, now he tried in Italian. And what does that say, again, about Magnus Carlsen's title defense and the preparation and work his team did to help him get that title?
Yeah, Magnus' team deserve a ton of credit because they chose variations that Magnus was, generally speaking, more comfortable in than Jan. That said, maybe what this match shows is that Jan had to choose more aggressive lines, things that weren't just a slight edge, that if he didn't play every single accurate move, it would dissipate and Magnus would be fine. But he played in Italian in the last game. He had to do something different, and it didn't work out for him, but at least he tried.
It was in Italian. Lucky for us, we have one of the world's leading experts in this opening for either color sitting right next to us. His name is Fabiano Caruana. And Fabiano, I'm playing through the opening moves. I guess the first one that had us talking was right here, Magnus committing to what you highlighted as one of the big decisions Black can make on the queen side between a6 and a5.
Well, I think that Magnus had a clear and healthy plan of development. Of course, all moves are possible here. a6 or a5 or h6 or castle. There are so many ways to play this. But what Magnus did was extremely logical and healthy. And it felt like Jan's Italian was sort of a spur-of-the-moment decision.
Right.
I don't think that it was prepared in advance. Because it felt like, although he made logical moves, he didn't have a plan of how to put a lot of pressure on Magnus.
Yeah.
So we saw what we kind of predicted. Knight c2, bishop e3 was a very logical way of approaching the position. It also led to a very, very slightly better for white, but pretty close to equal position, right?
Yeah.
And one where Magnus could make healthy developing moves and not feel under too much pressure. And I think like bishop takes e6 at this moment, not the best way to fight for an advantage. Bishop to e5 felt like if there's an advantage to be found, it's only after bishop to b5. I still feel like it's very close to equal.
Yeah.
But this would have been a more ambitious approach. And in the game, at this moment, it started to feel like Magnus is equalizing the position. His opening has been a success. He came into this game only needing a draw for it to be a good result, right? He's so far up in the match, was so far up in the match, that any draw, and he even said this, any draw is a good result. It takes it closer to overall victory. So he was happy with the result of the opening.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'll add is in real time, Robert had been suggesting potentially this as well. You mentioned a4 and bishop b5 after bishop e6 by Carlsen. Perhaps this was another way to keep it spicy and maybe try to induce a4 forward, right, Robert?
Yeah, at least there could be a target later in the game. I don't think it actually amounts to an advantage for white in the immediate position, but at least there are some long-term efforts. And as the game continued, instead of queen b3 with a4, I did like what Jan tried, right? He went for this position. He did get his queen to b3. Of course, Black went b6. And then he went h3, knight h2. So as this developed, it left Black with a difficult decision, but Magnus was well prepared, not in terms of before game preparation, but for this moment, that he didn't have to rush a decision. He didn't have to play d5, which we saw could get him into some difficulty in some of these lines. Instead, he played the simple queen d7, rook to d8, and made sure that he was ready to strike in the center when the time came.
And strike in the center he did. Obviously, we spent a lot of time calculating some potentially other ways Jan could have kept tension. Queen to b5 was a suggestion, a move earlier, perhaps instead of knight h2. Obviously, Yvonne, when she joined us, pointed out that maybe just the simple queen d8 is actually just totally fine for Black. So shout out to Yvonne for that. But really, I guess, knowing what we know now about the position, it seemed that even before committing to this plan of h3, knight h2, Fabi, that Jan had maybe miscalculated the critical moment that is coming up here very soon.
I think it's entirely possible he saw this d4 idea in advance when he played h3, and he thought that this would lead to an advantage for white, based on the line we saw in the game, where Black plays unusual moves. Rook to e4 and rook to f4 are quite unusual. You usually don't see rooks on these squares, especially when it's in white's territory and potentially attacked by a lot of pieces. In queen c2, we saw that attack. So I think he saw this in advance, and rook to f4 came as a surprise. Maybe he was expecting d3 and a sharp fight there, where black regains the a4 pawn, but white suddenly gets a very nice, stable center with c4, and or even trying to corral that rook slowly with g3 and b3. So he was probably happy with this in his calculations far in advance. And when rook to f4 happened, he looked unpleasantly surprised. And this is the moment where he had a chance to go for a drawn ending, and we all were expecting that.
And just to show that drawn ending, it would have occurred after rook d4, c4, and knight d5, and at the end of a massive simplification, when the smoke clears, what you see is what you get, something that is dead drawn and headed for equality, and apparently not to Jan's liking, enough so not to his liking that he played the move g3.
Yeah, and that move isn't really playing for a win. As we saw in the game, it was actually very easy for Magnus to play. He could make a draw at any moment, and it's white's king that's in danger. So I think that Jan, because of his recent struggles, he sort of has had enough. I was saying that perhaps he should have just made the draw. He would have to win 3 games in a row. That wasn't going to happen, but at least it gave him an opportunity to really play for a win, whereas this was playing for a loss.
Yeah. And again, playing for a loss is a really hard thing to say, and we won't go on and on about it. Obviously, we expressed our sentiments with the utmost respect for Jan Nepomniachtchi, but also, again, just very surprised because Magnus showed it at the board. This is, regardless of the fact that it ended up taking a rook in to get there, this is clearly a losing move after e takes f3 and queen takes g4. The result was never in doubt from here.
Yeah, I think that Jan, going into this position when he played g3, understood that this must be losing. But he probably thought the task of winning 3 games in a row, 2 with black, against Magnus, was an impossible one. And he is correct in that. I mean, we thought it was impossible, but it still feels better to make good moves. Even if you know that those good moves will only lead to a draw and probably to the end of the match. It leaves you with a better feeling, I think, when you play, accurately and it didn't work out, rather than when you play a move like g3, which is objectively bad and leads to a position like this, where Magnus had his choice of winning attempts and didn't even find the fastest one.
Yep.
Here we pointed out e takes f2. Queen takes f2 is the only move because king takes f2, queen h2 is that skewer we saw with the queen gain loss, and rook to d6, unstoppable threat of rook to g6. White can block it, but only with the queen, and white loses that queen and the game because the material deficit is so enormous at this point. So, to be honest, it's a bit. This is the most obvious way to win, but for some reason the move which came to everyone's mind, I think, was knight to f5.
Mm-hmm.
We
suggested it.
I think Yifan also felt like this was the natural course, and then also Magnus played it.
Yeah.
And Jan found a nice shot at keeping the game going, but we're already talking about trying to hang on for a few more moves, because objectively white will lose a lot of material in the process of trying to save his king, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, d6 was a fun little shot. Surprisingly, very hard move to play because you're not an engine, you're a human. Just taking the pawn and then continuing the attack was probably best for black. But instead, Robert, he took the forcing line, f takes e3. Let's note the fun line that giving this check and queen h2 check would actually be a very bad idea because of a pretty fun shot at the end of the line.
Yeah, and black
takes c7.
Black's still doing well because of rook takes d1 and the queen endgame should be good, but it's a problem to allow someone to queen with check, especially when you were supposed to be up a queen. So instead of that, of course, Magnus played accurately, and he entered a rook endgame that was actually quite instructive because he was only up 1 pawn after this precise sequence, and he said, I have the open file, the only one on the board. I have this outside passed pawn that eventually became a queen, and he just didn't give white any opportunities to exchange the queenside pawns. As we were highlighting during the game, if the 3 pawns on the queenside for each side were traded, the game becomes a theoretical draw. So as we came to this moment here, we were looking at lines where white has to strike with b4, and that's exactly what Jan did, but Magnus showed great accuracy to put this rook behind the a pawn and make sure that there was no rook c4, c5, and then a5. That would be a critical move for white to dislodge the defender and then start trading the pawns. But because the rook's on a2, the rook would just capture the pawn a5, and that ends all of white's play.
Because of that, Jan's hand was forced yet again. He decided to go for the most direct, aggressive approach, activate the king, and see if we get some counterplay. But Magnus accurately calculated that the h-pawn would ultimately be too much. And as it came up the board, one last critical decision to make, possibly f6 and g5 was a slightly faster winning attempt, but Magnus took the safe approach, the one that felt good, to force the queen on the board. And it wasn't long, right? I guess a good lesson in technique here, right? Because a lesser man might have messed this thing game up. There's some tricky opportunities for white if the pawn does reach a7, but a centralized queen is black's best friend here.
Yeah, I think this endgame is far from simple, and although Magnus made it look very simple, especially with this nice queen to e4 move, and we saw later the nice king to g7 move, just one inaccuracy, and it's very easy to imagine white saving this game. And I'm sure queen e4 was seen in advance, and probably the reason he made the decision to go for this rather than f6, which also seemed pretty good, was because he saw queen e4 and white has no good way of coordinating the pieces. If white could get a6, a rook in front of the pawn like rook b8, a7, then we're already talking about black taking a perpetual, trying to make a draw. But white can't coordinate the pieces here, and they played the rest of the moves pretty quickly because I think they both calculated that white has no good options except for what Jan did.
Yep.
Which was probably the best chance, but not sufficient.
It's a good lesson to note that the queen in the center, constantly threatening forks, ways to win the white rook. Again, examples like here, you can't just continue to push things.
This queen e6 here would attack the rook and pawn. The rook has to go behind the pawn to defend it, otherwise the pawn is lost.
And then we see the common tactic of picking up the rook. So very instructive and precise by Magnus Carlsen, and enough to ultimately win the game when he found the move. Queen to c5, pushing the pawn would lose the rook, and everything else gets closer to black simply creating a new pass pawn and winning the game. And with that, the last Coinbase Rapid Recap of the 2021 FIDE World Chess Championship comes to an end. Chess.com's coverage of the 2021 FIDE World Championship is brought to you by our partners at Coinbase. Whether you're just thinking about making your first crypto purchase, just wanting to learn a little bit more about the crypto industry, or if you've been doing this thing for years and you're an experienced trader, Coinbase is the place to be. Visit coinbase.com/chess and get $5 in free Bitcoin just for signing up and verifying your account today. We really encourage you to do so. Go check them out at coinbase.com.